IO9 presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 30 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hi, I'm John Joseph Adams. I'm the editor of several anthologies, such as Wasteland and The Living Dead. My latest books are Brave New Worlds, The Way of the Wizard, and The Living Dead 2. And I'm also the editor of Lightspeed Magazine and Fantasy Magazine.
And I'm David Barr Kirtley. My short fiction appears in books such as New Voices in Science Fiction and Fantasy the Best of the Year. And my newest stories are Cats in Victory in Lightspeed, The Skullface City in The Living Dead 2, and Family Tree in The Way of the Wizard. And today on the show we'll be interviewing Jennifer Ouellette. She's the author of 3 popular science books, Black Bodies and Quantum Cats, Tales from the Annals of Physics, The Physics of the Buffyverse, and her most recent book, The Calculus Diaries, How Math Can Help You Lose Weight, Win in Vegas, and Survive a Zombie Apocalypse. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, Discover, Salon, Nature, and Physics Today, and she maintains a general science and culture group blog called Cocktail Party Physics. And for the past 3 years, she's been the director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, an initiative of the National Academy of Sciences aimed at fostering creative collaborations between scientists and entertainment industry professionals.
Okay, so let's get to our interview.
All right, so we're here with Jennifer Ouellette. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Okay, so first of all, your books are full of references to fantasy and science fiction. So how did you get interested in fantasy and science fiction, and what are some of your favorite examples?
You know, I think that it started when I was a kid. I fell in love with horror, actually, first and foremost. So I guess, I think probably the fantasy side came first. I was a big fan of werewolves, the films, the old classic I Was a Teenage Werewolf film. And I loved these anthologies called Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And they were just full of these short stories, including one about Jack the Ripper that was my first encounter with the unreliable narrator. So it kind of like opened my eyes to this whole like rich fantasy world. And over time, I think I moved into science fiction that way. Starting with the fantasy and with the horror, I became a fan of like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but also loved things like Battlestar Galactica and loved Connie Willis's books and, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and all those classic works.
So it seems like every time the term quantum mechanics comes up, somebody mentions the movie What the Bleep Do We Know?
Yes.
So are you familiar with that movie? And what do you think of that?
I'm not a fan. That's unfortunately an example of quantum mechanics being deliberately misused and misunderstood. I actually know one of the men, a philosophy of science professor at Columbia, David Albert, is one of the people who's featured in that film. And I think he went on kind of a warpath when that film came out because they edited him in such a way that he seemed to be agreeing with their premise when in fact he directly contradicted it. There is this whole movement of people, I think, who misunderstand quantum mechanics as having something to do with like a universal consciousness and all these sorts of things. And it means they start saying things like water molecules have feelings and you can actually, change the state of something by thinking about it. That is not what quantum mechanics says. Articles like What the Bleep do a lot of damage in terms of scientific literacy.
Okay, so many of the claims that you hear made about the scientist Nikola Tesla sound like science fiction, and he even appeared as a mad scientist doing experiments in matter teleportation in Christopher Nolan's film The Prestige. What are some? So what's the real story when it comes to Tesla and his work?
Well, he was a man way ahead of his time. I mean, he overstated the case for many things, but he had a lot of ideas that were considered absolutely insane. And let's face it, in his later years, he was a little crazy. He was definitely eccentric. He was very OCD, didn't like women with pearl earrings and all these various things. But his ideas, his concepts, particularly when it came to wireless transmission and wireless transmission of energy in particular, it turned out to be more challenging, I think, than he anticipated. But in fact, just a few years ago, scientists did finally achieve the transmission of energy across, wirelessly without cords. It's now, possible to conceive of a future where you could charge your cell phone from across the room. You won't have to plug it into an outlet. You get a huge energy losses when you do that, but you can do it. And the other thing I think that Tesla really understood was resonances. He understood, that these vibrations, if they were in sync, if they could resonate with the natural resonant frequency of something. It's kind of like the Memorex commercials that shatter a wine glass. He understood that you could do that at a large scale, and you could actually cause, say, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge to crumble. And we've actually seen these sorts of phenomena since his time. But at the time, people thought he was crazy.
Did he look like David Bowie?
I don't know if he looked like David Bowie, but he was very striking. He was tall and thin, and he deliberately wore platforms to make himself look even taller. And, he just had that sort of aristocratic look to him. I think he was a showman, first and foremost. He knew how to wow people, particularly in his younger years. He'd put on these amazing shows, and a couple of the tricks that he did with electricity, people still don't know how he did them. He knew how to hold a ball of energy, of lightning in his hand. How do you do that? I don't know.
And did he have sort of this rivalry with Thomas Edison?
Yes, that was nasty. Edison does not come off well in that story. It was about alternating current versus direct current, and this was a case where Tesla actually had the better idea of alternating current. It's what we use for power transmission today, but Edison had already invested in direct current, and so he did everything he could to destroy Tesla and Tesla's business partner, so that he could including electrocuting small animals. And that was just a way of turning the public against AC current so that, his corporations would succeed. It's unfortunate. I mean, I think it's a cautionary tale of what happens when you let, economic and corporate interests and politics interfere with science, because really the better system, in a pure idealistic meritocracy should win out. And that was alternating current. And it did win out, but Tesla never saw any money from it.
So you mentioned Buffy the Vampire Slayer earlier. And you also wrote a book called The Physics of the Buffyverse. So how did you go about getting that book published?
Well, it was written on the heels of the first book. In the Black Bodies book, I was trying to find a way to make material that had been covered a lot before in popular science fresh. So I tried to put physics back into the broader culture, and I found, film, TV, literature, plays, all these things as ways of referencing. And I realized very quickly, I was a big Buffy fan, that I could think of an example from the Buffyverse for a whole bunch of them. So I thought it would be possible, to write an entire book about physics in the Buffyverse. It wouldn't necessarily be our physics, but you're dealing with a fictional world. And anytime you're dealing with a world building, so long as the rules are self-consistent, those rules are the physics, the rules that govern that particular fictional universe. So I felt it was possible. Several physicists of my acquaintance were very skeptical and dared me that I wouldn't be able to write it. And the result is I did.
Were you at all influenced by Lawrence Krauss's physics of Star Trek?
Yeah. Obviously, it was modeled on that, and I think Lawrence was one of the first people to do that sort of pop culture and science tie-in. Star Trek, I think you can make more direct ties with real world physics. You can be less metaphorical in your approach, just because it's just such a techie heaven, and particularly these days, you can point to lots of technologies that were science fiction when the series first premiered, that now we actually use versions of that. Our flip-up cell phones are those communicators. You've got, versions of the holodeck in development. You've got whatever the thing is, McCoy, the tricorder, the medical tricorder. You've got versions of that in development. It doesn't look exactly like it did on the show, but so many young people were inspired by that show to become scientists, and they went on to invent the things that they thought were really cool from Star Trek. I think it's a wonderful example of science fiction actually leading to real world science and vice versa.
Okay, and so the book list review of that book mentions that you explore the ins and outs of vampire physiology. So tell us, what are some of the ins and outs of vampire physiology?
Well, I think I focused on things that had a physics basis. So I focused on things like night vision. But one which is unusual. I mean, they would basically be heat-seeking predators. They would be able to hunt in various ways, through smell, through being able to see in the dark and things like that. So they would have the equivalent of like night vision goggles. The other thing that's interesting, and this is common knowledge, I think, among vampire fans. There are certain physiological diseases and conditions that have parallels to vampirism. The most famous is porphyria. the most extreme cases of porphyria, which are extremely rare. You have very, very extreme sensitivity to sunlight. You actually, over time, get an appearance that looks very, very much like the classic Nosferatu, where the lips and the gums recede and you end up getting a fang-like, skull-like look to the face. And it's been said, I mean, that legend had it that people had, who had this disease could treat it by drinking blood. That's actually not true, because the acids in your stomach dissolve the blood, they eat away at the things that you need in the blood. But in fact, you can get blood transfusions and you can find ways, to actually treat that disease. And blood is the key. Blood is the life. So there is something to the vampire legends, but it tends to be an accumulation of all these various real-world diseases that kind of, over time, people didn't understand them and therefore assigned this supernatural feature to them.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about your involvement with the Science and Entertainment Exchange.
Yeah, I just recently stepped down after 2 years of heading up this program. It's a wonderful program. It's started 2 years ago by the National Academy of Sciences, which, if you don't know, was founded by Abraham Lincoln. It's an independent body that's essentially there to give, unbiased scientific advice to the government, regardless of political orientation. And one of the things they care deeply about is education and outreach. How can we get people excited and appreciative of science? How can we change some of the negative images of science that has appeared, particularly, I think, in the 1950s B movies, science fiction B movies. You had like the mad scientist and all these various tropes. They were always wearing white lab coats. I do think that's changing, and the exchange essentially tries to build a grassroots community. They put scientists together with writers, directors, producers, and put them in a room together and let them brainstorm and come up with cool new ideas for series, for plots, for things like that. We've worked with Marvel, for instance, on Iron Man 2 and Thor and the Avengers. We've worked with Caprica. We've worked with various other shows out there. So I think that this is a great time to be doing that, because Hollywood, I think, has realized that science sells, that science is cool, and it's a great resource for them for interesting characters, new twists on old plots, a fresh take on an old genre. And the scientists, in turn, I think, like it because it's a way of reaching a very broad audience and getting the word out that scientists are not necessarily, geeks and nerds and mad scientists. You still get that. Walter Bishop on Fringe, classic mad scientist. In fact, they're playing on that stereotype. Big Bang Theory, you have the classic nerds, and they're playing on those stereotypes. But you've also got people on Bones and CSI and Numbers and a lot of these, and Eureka and a lot of these other shows where you get much more diversity in how scientists are portrayed. And I think that can only be a good thing.
Could you give an example of like what a specific change was to a movie as a result of the exchange?
Well, in Iron Man 2, since that one's out, they had a whole scene there dealing with, creating a new element. They weren't sure how they were going to handle that. They didn't know what a particle accelerator would look like. They knew vaguely that scientists were able to use these big machines to create, new elements, but they didn't really understand, some of the details about that. So I think that in the end, the scientists that they worked with helped get at least a rough look, so that, if a scientist could look at it and say, oh yeah, that he's building a particle accelerator to that particular plot point. Caprica, of course, deals very, very closely with the notion of AI, with virtual worlds, with the meshing of, can you download consciousness into a robot body, which is essentially the thrust of the series. And we matched them with a person who works in AI and robotics and genetic algorithms at Northwestern University. His name's Malcolm MacGyver, and he's been their script consultant for the duration of the series. And he pretty much helps them develop some of their themes, helps them get their science correct. If he feels they're going in a wrong direction, he'll say, well, you can't do that, but you can do something interesting like this. And he has a philosophy background too, so I think he's meshed well with the writing team on that.
And is it only for film and TV, or do you work like with novelists as well, or?
Well, in this day and age, comic books and novelists and all these sorts of things feed into Hollywood. So the exchange will also work with the occasional sci-fi novelist. We've gotten a couple queries from, aspiring sci-fi novelists that we've helped out on stuff. In general, those people tend to be pretty plugged into the scientific community, unlike, a lot of Hollywood producers, writers, and directors. Sci-fi sci-fi novelists tend to already really love science to a certain extent.
And so you've gotten sort of sneak peeks at Thor and sort of upcoming movies like that?
Yeah. I'm excited about Thor. We're very excited about Tron Legacy. That was one of the first consults that we did. Where again, there was a lot of questions that they had about, what the world would be like inside a computer and how you would get in there and how you would get out and all these various things. And we put together an entire think tank of world-class scientists for them. And they just brainstormed for 2 hours and got a lot of their questions answered. Very curious to see how the movie turns out, but from the footage that I've seen, the 3D footage that I've seen, and I think thanks to Comic-Con, almost everyone has seen at this point, it's fabulous. It's going to look amazing.
Well, so you mentioned Comic-Con, and I think I heard you say that you, in another interview, that you've been to Dragon Con. I mean, do you go to many conventions like that, and sort of what kind of things do you do when you're there?
I go when I have a session, essentially. I enjoy them. I really like them. I've only been to a few. But I love the costumes. I love the community. I love it's the one place in the world where these people can dress up in their outfits. I have certain clothing, let's just put it this way, that I can only wear at a con. I have like a nice, cool, full-length steampunk trench coat. And the last Comic-Con, I actually got one of those little hats with the goggles. I'm all set. The next con I go to, I'm going to be all steampunked out. But at Dragon Con, I saw this young girl who was a dead ringer for Hit Girl in Kick-Ass. I love seeing that. I don't know how she just had, it was dead on. It was a perfect costume.
And you're a black belt, right? I mean, what are some of the things that you've noticed that books and movies tend to get right and get wrong about the way that they portray martial arts and martial artists?
Well, look, I have a black belt in jiu-jitsu, and particularly, I think, street savvy part of jiu-jitsu. And, a lot of the fight scenes are choreographed. They're heavily choreographed. There's certain techniques that are very showy and that you need to be pretty much a gymnast and very flexible to be able to pull off. The high kicks, the punches, the fact that people only attack 2 at a time. They wait their turn rather than just kind of piling on. Even Bruce Lee in real life could never handle more than 2 attackers. And once you've got 3 or more people there, you've got a real problem. You're very outnumbered. But I've actually also noticed a trend in film and television now towards these more realistic fight scenes, and I love them. One of my favorite climactic scenes was, I think the tail end of season 1 of Veronica Mars, where her father goes at it with the killer of her best friend. And they're basically 2 middle-aged white guys who don't really fight a lot, battling it out in a life or death situation, one trying to save his daughter, the one trying to kill her. And it's not pretty. It's ugly. They're grunting, they're panting, they're getting tired, And that is what a real fight is like. I mean, people do not have these 15-minute athletic, showy fights. But it's fun to watch. I'm a huge Jackie fan and Jet Li fan, and I love watching those beautifully choreographed fights.
So your new book is called The Calculus Diaries, How Math Can Help You Lose Weight, Win in Vegas, and Survive a Zombie Apocalypse. So did you use calculus to convince the publishers to buy the book, or how'd that work?
I'm sure there was math involved in some way. They have their own internal algorithms for that. I wasn't sure they would actually want it, but they liked the idea of someone who is not naturally good at math, someone who actually kind of doesn't like it very much, tackling calculus and basically finding that it's really not that scary. It's actually kind of cool. It's not that I'm going to go out now and, ace an AP calculus exam, but I do have a deeper appreciation for math, and I would hope that comes through in the book and will help other people kind of understand a little bit more what math is about, where calculus fits in all of that, and the fact that we think it's something that we only deal with in a classroom in a really, esoteric way, but in fact, we're doing calculus all the time. I mean, calculus describes change in motion. So if you think of anything, any process in the world that deals with change in motion, exercise, diet, catching a fly ball. Worms can do a form of calculus. They navigate by testing the differences in salt concentrations in soil. That's basically taking a derivative. They're looking at a ratio, and how that changes, depends where they go to look for food. So when you do it in a classroom, in a textbook, you end up using these very kind of simplified versions of textbook problems. They're kind of boring, they're uninspiring, but they're solvable. Once you get out into the real world, which is messy and complex, it gets a little more complicated. And I think textbooks shy away from some of those as a result. But I think as long as you're honest with students about the fact that, you can do this with calculus, it'll be really hard. You'll need a computer for it, but it can be done. I think they would get it more. I think there's something to be said for helping them create their own calculus problems and go out and collect data and try and construct a problem and figure out what's relevant and what's not. And it's important for critical thinking. Believe it or not, one of the talks that I gave at DragonCon on the skeptic track was on calculus. It wasn't the most exciting topic for a lot of people, but there were zombies. Maybe that helped.
Yeah, so speaking of zombies, so what can calculus teach us about how to survive a zombie apocalypse?
Well, it's interesting. One of the scientists that I met through the course of the exchange is named Robert Smith. He's at the University of Ottawa, and he studies how disease outbreaks spread, population dynamics. And that's essentially what the zombie problem is. Particularly in films like Zombieland, it's portrayed as like a form of mad cow disease gone wild that just spreads incredibly rapidly. And this guy essentially used calculus and other forms of math to create this mathematical model. And once he had the model, he was able to plug in different, strategies, to see how that would affect the zombie population. And I got to tell you, if you do nothing, the zombies will wipe you out in about 4 days. The human race cannot afford for zombies to be real. If we ally ourselves with the vampires, our chances are much better. But really, the best approach is the Zombieland approach. It's lock and load. It's basically kill as many as possible, as quickly as possible. A short, sharp series of brutal attacks to cull the population as fast as possible. It's the only way you'll get rid of the outbreak.
Okay, and so what can World of Warcraft teach us about infectious disease?
That is an interesting story. I loved this story. World of Warcraft, several years ago, they've had a deliberate zombie epidemic as part of the Wrath of the Lich King game. But in 2005, they had a dungeon that was designed specifically for advanced players. And the demon that controlled it, Hakar, would hit the players with this spell called Corrupted Blood. And essentially what happens is periodically, every 30 or 40 seconds or so, they'll explode. There'll be a little like red explosion, like blood coming out of their avatar to go blah. And every time that happens, they lose a few life points. And so it becomes this ticking time bomb. They have to kill the demon and beat the level before their life points run out. It was fine for advanced players because but just to get there, you had to be a pretty strong player and you could generally figure it out. There was a mistake in the algorithm, and some of the non-playable animal companions got infected, but they didn't show symptoms. And then they wandered off to lower levels of the game and infected lower ranking players. And those players were not well equipped to deal with it. And many of them, particularly the beginners, would be killed outright. And panic ensued. And here's where the story gets interesting. An epidemiologist at Rutgers named Nina Pfefferman found out about this, and it turns out that she could get a lot of these players would take their play and post them online. You can find tons of YouTube videos of World of Warcraft sessions. She got access to a lot of those, and she started studying the behaviors, because one of the problems when you model epidemiological phenomena, you have to deal with the unpredictability of human behavior. You can only approximate using math how humans are going to react. And your model is only as good as your data. Your inputs are very important. So she said, if we can get better data of how people actually react, that would be fantastic. It's unethical to deliberately infect, a population and watch what happens. But online, it's virtual, and this was completely unplanned, and people reacted accordingly. And of course, if you've ever met a gamer, you know that their avatars are an extension of themselves, and they care very deeply what happens. It's almost as if it's happening to them. So she felt that their behavior rang true, and it was great. You had people trying to help. You had people running away in panic and thereby spreading the disease, which actually happened during the Black Plague, during certain cholera outbreaks, all these things. You had people deliberately infecting communities because they were bitter, because they were dying. It was the Typhoid Mary phenomenon. And apparently there was one poor dude that decided he was going to be the prophet of doom. He was going to stand on the steps of the town square and say the end is near and kind of narrate the carnage. So I'm very interested to see what she does with this. They've also been looking at Second Life as a way of studying things like economics, behavioral economics, because you can get real world data. You can actually see how humans behave. And granted, it's a virtual situation, but it's a much better simulation than I think trying to guess would be.
So you're married to a physicist, right? Could you
Yes.
talk about what role knowing him and his physicist buddies plays in you writing a book about math?
It was a big, big help. I would drag him to Disneyland, to Vegas, surfing in Hawaii, and I'd say, help me build a calculus problem out of this.
There was a thing I heard you say about the two of you watching waves on a beach, and he had a different way of looking at it.
Yeah. It was shortly after we got engaged. It was one of those romantic, sunsets over the water kind of thing while we were driving down the Pacific Coast Highway. I think it was just outside of Malibu. And we pulled over to watch the sunset because that's what one does when one is newly engaged. And, he had his arms around me and I'm sitting there admiring, the waves and, the setting sun kind of casting all these gorgeous colors. And he leaned in and he said, wouldn't it be fascinating to take a Fourier transform of those waves? And a Fourier transform is just a calculus equation, basically, that takes a complex wave and breaks it down into its components parts so you can understand it a little bit better and rebuild it. And all digital signal processing, for instance, uses the Fourier transform. What you're doing right now with your podcast, the software that you're doing at some point is going to use a Fourier transform. But I loved that because while I could appreciate the scene perfectly fine, it was lovely, he saw something more. He saw everything that's hidden unless you speak nature's language, and nature's language is math. So he actually saw a reality underlying what I saw, and it made me want to see those things too.
And speaking of Vegas, wasn't a lot of the development of math driven by gambling?
Well, probability theory in particular was pretty much driven by wealthy patrons with gambling problems. Galileo, for instance, wasn't at all interested in probability, but one of his patrons was, an inveterate gambler and basically said, I'm paying you. I want you to answer this question for me. Why is it that in a game of this many dice, one number comes up more than others? And Galileo is the one that basically said the probability of something happening is equivalent to the different ways in which it can occur. Craps is based on this. You've got two dice, and you've got only one way to make a 2, snake eyes, but you've got like 5 or 6 different ways to make a 7. So 7 is the most common roll, and 2 is one of the least common rolls. And it's not an accident that the casinos make sure that 7 is the losing roll once a game of craps gets underway.
So Danica McKellar, who played Winnie on the TV show The Wonder Years, has published a series of books aimed at middle school girls that try to present math as sexy. What do you think about that approach?
Yeah, I love Danica's books. I know she's been criticized for making math pink. And there's something to that. But I have nieces, and my nieces are very different. One is kind of, a little budding gothling, and she likes comic books and anime and manga and, horror. She's a little geek girl after my own heart, really. And the other is kind of an all-American girly girl, and she likes pink. Which one of those is Danica McKellar's book going to reach? Probably the more mainstream of my nieces. But that audience needs to be reached. And I think that what Danica is doing is extremely valuable and very useful. It's not a bad thing to make math sexy. I mean, David Krumholtz, who played Charlie in Numbers, was sexy. He was a good-looking mathematician. Certainly all of the people on CSI are very, very pretty, and they have sex lives and all that sorts of things. Maybe we need to get over this notion, that you can't be both. Danica, I think, is very deliberately trying to reach a specific audience, and I think that she has just the right approach to reach that audience. And it's an audience that there's really nothing else out there that exists for them. So I think it's important.
And so in addition to your books, you also have a blog. Could you tell us a little bit about what sorts of things you cover on there and sort of what it's meant to you?
Yeah, it's called Cocktail Party Physics. And I started it when the Black Bodies book came out because what I should have done was titled that book Cocktail Party Physics, because that's what it is. It's just got a little dabbling. It's got some history. It's got some art, some literature, some culture, some science, and it's all kind of woven in together. That's kind of what the blog is. It's kind of this chatty cocktail party sort of conversation about things that are happening in science, specifically physics, but it's not limited to that. And sometimes I'll talk about, education and outreach. Almost never talk about politics, but occasionally we will, when it impinges on science policy. It's supposed to be a fun read. I have a little avatar called Jean-Luc Picant. She's kind of like a faux French, kind of play on Jean-Luc Picard, obviously. And brought on some co-bloggers a couple years ago because I was getting so busy with the outreach, the Hollywood outreach, that I really needed some help on the blog. I think I still probably write the vast majority of the posts, but it's nice getting help every now and then when I'm not expecting it.
So, like, what are some of the topics you've covered recently?
Well, poker-playing physicists, all the outtakes from the Discover article got put in the blog post, so there's a lot about game theory and the probabilities in poker on there. The Vidara Hotel in Vegas had a death ray phenomenon, which is very, very similar to the Archimedes myth, that he used mirrors essentially to set fire to Roman ships that were trying to invade the city of Syracuse. The Mythbusters have tried to test that twice, and I think now they're going to test it one more time with President Obama being on board. I did a blog post about that. I think I just put one up about trebuchets and catapults. There was this really funny video that's going around of a little tiny trebuchet that hurls little pies at insects and hits flies in the face. And I talked about the differences between these different medieval devices and the physics behind them, you know, in a very lighthearted, fun way, really. You can always quote Monty Python at the very end. Medieval castle, you know, Monty Python's Holy Grail, they actually use a trebuchet and various catapult things to basically hurl cows over onto Arthur and his knights.
Okay, great. And so are there any other recent or upcoming projects that you'd like to mention?
No, I'm back to writing. I'm looking at what my next book writing project is going to be, but mostly I'm just kind of happy and relieved to be back to writing full time and scaling back on some of the education and outreach that I've been doing for the last couple of years and kind of returning to my true roots.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Jennifer Ouellette for joining us on the show. Okay, and so, you know, as I was editing that interview, I just sort of noticed that Jennifer was mentioning all these TV shows that are on right now, and I'm not actually sure I've watched any of them. And that just sort of got me thinking about sort of television and, you know, what's the role of TV in science fiction. And, you know, John and I were interviewed recently for this podcast called Podcast Squared. And so sort of, you know, when he's talking about our show, he's sort of saying that this isn't like all the other sci-fi podcasts that talk about TV shows and movies. These guys talk about all this obscure stuff you've never heard of, like books and short stories and things. And it just kind of struck me because, you know, I really think of the books and the short stories as the absolute heart of the field, and the film and TV stuff as being, you know, more peripheral, you know, and sort of just among people that I hang out with. You know, everybody knows, you know, Paolo Bacigalupi and China Mieville and Kelly Link and people like that. And, you know, I don't know anybody who watches like Stargate Atlantis and stuff like that. It just sort of seems like, you know, like when I was a kid, I would watch lots of cartoons and TV shows and stuff. But sort of as I became a teenager, I kind of absorbed this growing awareness that science fiction novelists, you know, were often embarrassed by science fiction on TV, and, you know, that the really exciting stuff was all going on in prose. And I don't know, do you agree with that sort of assessment, that that's how a lot of science fiction novelists have felt?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was one of the things that I learned early on. Like when even when I just first went to my interview with Gordon Van Gelder to get the job at the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which was, you know, the first job I had in the field. I went in prepared to talk to him, and I just assumed that as the editor of a major science fiction and fantasy magazine, he would like know everything about science fiction movies and TV shows and whatever. And it's like, you know, he hadn't even seen Empire Strikes Back. And you know, television, I think he'd even seen less. Like, I mean, he'd seen some movies, but you know, he'd seen even less television. And, you know, like you were saying, I mean, it's like, you know, he's read all the prose fiction that, you know, you consider classic and whatnot. And he's very up to date on all the contemporary stuff as well. But yeah, as far as television and film and everything, yeah, he wasn't as well versed, and I think that's fairly common. You know, you start going to conventions and you talk to some of the pro writers, and a lot of them have that same view. Although there is a fair number of pro writers who do have interest in television shows, and some of them end up writing, you know, the sort of novelizations or media tie-in novels, and some of them end up doing other things. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly no you certainly can't assume that any science fiction or fantasy writer actually likes, you know, science fiction and fantasy movies and TV, or at least not the great majority of them.
But, you know, like I went to the dentist within the last couple of years, and there was a new hygienist who they'd hired. You know, and I told her I write science fiction, and she's like, oh, and she starts talking about Star Trek, and And it's just like, it's like that, you meet people outside the field and that, if they find out you write science fiction, they assume you just must be absolutely fanatical about Star Trek, And I mean, I like Star Trek a lot. I have fond memories of watching the original series reruns, after school when I was a kid. But I mean, I watched one episode of Star Trek Enterprise and I was like, it's all right, but I don't feel like I need to watch the show. And I didn't watch any more of it,
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think a lot of this view that sci-fi TV is kind of bad, is outdated to an extent. I mean, television has been getting a lot better, in the last 10, 15 years or so, with networks like HBO and Showtime, who have less restrictions about what they can show. And, it's not so much episodic TV where the episodes are all sort of interchangeable and you can show them in any order and nothing really changes. That, there are more of these big story arcs and, telling long epic stories and things like that. And I mean, it had really seemed like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, like I was really going to have to completely revise my opinion of science fiction on TV, because this is when we had, Battlestar Galactica was going and it was just fantastic, and Lost was going and it was very, very good. And these were just, shows that I was really excited about and that I really looked forward to watching. And then they both ended in a very, how to say it, disappointing way. I mean, they both sort of, in my opinion, kind of were revealed to be sort of Shaggy dog stories in the end. And that really sort of did disillusion me all over again about science fiction on television.
You might want to explain what a Shaggy dog story is for all those people who haven't read all the short stories that you have. I think only people who are deeply ingrained in science fiction and read short stories and whatnot have ever heard that term.
Oh, all right. Well, yeah, I mean, a Shaggy dog story is a sort of overly long, complicated story that never really goes anywhere, and it just kind of leads up to a dumb joke, or just ends with nothing really happening at the end. And so that's really how I felt about the series finale of Battlestar Galactica and of Lost. And those shows, it seems like they both kind of, it's almost eerie how easy it is to draw parallels between them kind of falling apart. They sort of fell apart in the same exact ways. I mean, Battlestar Galactica to an extent, but Lost in particular, you kind of always had the feeling that they were making it up as they went along, and they didn't really know where it was going. Battlestar Galactica, it wasn't until maybe like 2.5 years or so that I really was sure that they didn't know where this was going. And Lost, I was sure that they, almost from the start, that they didn't know where it was going, but it was still fun. And then every once in a while, I would sort of give up on it, and then people would say, no, it gets really good again. And I would, start watching again, and it would get really good again. And sometimes I would sort of wonder, maybe they do actually know where this is going. But, in the end, obviously they didn't. Kind of when I gave up on Battlestar Galactica was when Billy died. That was the biggest point. I sort of gave up on it, and then people convinced me to watch it again in preparation for the finale. But that was like a point in the story where you were just like, wow, this is obviously not supposed to happen. I think the actor got another job or something, so they had to kill off the character, and it just did not fit into the story at all. And it was sort of the same thing on Lost, right? Like they, Mr. Echo, right? It was a similar sort of situation where, because of the actor, they had to kill off the character in a way that, just did not seem like it fit the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in the case of Mr. Echo, they were clearly setting him up to be a very important figure in the storyline, and to have to kill him off kind of ruined that whole part of the arc. And, ultimately, I don't know if you remember in Lost, that when they had the original survivors of 815, and then they discovered the tailies, the people who were in the tail section of the plane, and so they landed in this other part of the island. It's like, so that was awesome when that first happened, and they were discovering then, and we were spending whole episodes following them, and that was really interesting. But then they all disappear. I mean, it's like they all die or whatever. I think they all got killed actually, but they all are off the show before long. I mean, it's none of them factor into the denouement of the show. It's like they're all long gone. So it's like, well, what was the point of them? It's, it's like, oh, well, that was some extra filler to keep, to help stretch the show out to 6 seasons or whatever. Yeah, but I'm with you totally on Lost. From the first episode, within the first 3 episodes, I watched the first 3 episodes initially and I quit. And it's your fault that I watched it, 'cause you were saying how awesome it was. And so I was like, okay, I'll give it another shot. 'Cause I didn't hate it. I was watching it and I was like, this is interesting, but there is no way any of this is going to make any sense. And I was right. It doesn't make any sense. But, I admit, once I gave it a shot, I did really get into it. And it was one of those shows that, you watch it on DVD, you better not have anything else to do that day because you're just going to shotgun them one after another and you're not going to be able to stop watching them because it's like the way the episodes end. It's just like, oh my God, I want to see what happens next. And, I felt that way about the show for pretty much the whole run, but man, there was some rough patches there and, especially the last season was pretty uneven. And yeah, the finale was just complete nonsense, I thought. I mean, it's really disappointing.
Yeah, I guess we should give a spoiler warning that we're going to talk about the finales. So if you haven't, if you don't want it spoiled, you should, stop listening now. But
you can consult the show notes, at which point you can find out that it's safe to return. So we don't want you to have to miss the whole show.
But I mean, both, and again, there are these weird parallels between the finale, the series finale of Lost and the series finale of Battlestar Galactica, because in both cases you had this story that was kind of this creepy science fiction story. It was always sort of spooky and weird. And then in the end, it turns out to be, like the last episode, it becomes this sort of like there's angels and the divine plan, and it's just very saccharine and schmaltzy. And, it was just like it didn't fit at all in my view with any of the rest of the show, and I would have much rather had, particularly Lost. I mean, so many of the season finales for that show were great, and they were so spooky. And I just saw that as a spooky show, and I thought it should have had a spooky finale,
Yeah, the Lost finale was especially schmaltzy.
Oh, and I don't know. I think
Battlestar Galactica was actually more offensive to intellectually.
Well, and another thing, I swear, I think I heard both people from both shows say this, that they got to the end and were basically kind of like, I don't know, from a plot perspective, how I can possibly wrap this up. But that doesn't matter because the show, it's all about the characters.
Oh, yeah, I know. What a cop-out that is, right? Actually, I mean, if you want to be sane, if you want to keep your sanity, and you watch any of Battlestar Galactica at all, don't ever listen to anything Ron Moore says. Don't listen to any interviews with him. Don't read any interviews with him. He's infuriating. And
I mean, it just never seemed at all to me that either of those shows were all about the characters, because it always seemed like the characters changed their personalities and agendas 100% almost from scene to scene, depending on the needs of the plot, Yeah.
No, I've certainly heard a lot of people criticizing Battlestar for that. And to a lesser extent Lost as well. But yeah, sure. That was certainly a problem. And so, yeah, that kind of does defeat that argument. It was more surprising to me that Battlestar went the way it did. I mean, obviously, as people have pointed out, they've got the God stuff in there all along. Right. And so it's like, oh, well, you can't really complain too much when the God stuff comes in at the end. But it's like, well, yeah, I can. Because, it's like, it doesn't make sense.
But I mean, even if you say there were themes of religion from the start, so therefore you can't complain when religion plays a role in the story at the end. I mean, that's fine as far as it goes. But Starbuck turns out to be an angel and she disappears. There's just, I just do absolutely not believe anyone who says that if you go back from the beginning and watch it, it all makes so much sense now, knowing that that's how it's going to turn out. Give me a break, Yeah.
I remember, Dave and I and some of our friends all watched this episode together because we were all excited about it. And so it was about, I don't know, 8 or 10 of us, and we're all sitting around the TV watching. And when that happened, just oh man, just the audible size of, or the audible exasperation in that room was sort of astonishing. Because we're not the sorts that will talk during a movie or a TV show or whatever, but just we couldn't restrain our frustration with what was happening. I mean, because actually the first half of the episode, the finale is 2 hours. And so the first half of it's pretty awesome. And then I think I tell people, if you're going to watch it to the end, go ahead and watch it, but then stop watching after an hour because nothing that happens in that second hour is going to make you happy. But yeah, that when Starbuck just disappears like that, that was the worst, I think.
And I mean, I do have a certain amount of sympathy for TV writers because I mean, they're just just as a prose fiction writer, there's just so much that you can take for granted. Whereas when you actually have to put it on television, it just must be a nightmare. I mean, like we were talking about in Lost, a couple of the things, and I guess the writer's strike happened in the middle of one of the seasons, and so they had this much bigger story planned out, and then they kind of had to truncate it abruptly. And I remember watching one of those bonus features with for Battlestar Galactica where they were saying that the the Cylon Centurions, the big steel robot things, are so expensive to do the computer graphics for that they can only put in like 8 minutes of them per episode or something. And just like as a writer, that must be so frustrating where, you know, you have a script and then they're like, nope, sorry, your script calls for, you know, 11 minutes of robots and we can only afford 8 minutes of robots. You're going to have to cut out you're going to have to cut out a scene or two.
Right. Well, I mean, George Martin was talking about that, right? I mean, that was one of the reasons he couldn't stand to work in Hollywood, because everything he was writing, they would always say that to him about it. After the Battlestar finale, like I was tweeting angry tweets about Ron Moore and how he was dead to me, and and you know, basically, I intended to never watch anything that he was on again. But actually, you know, I guess shortly after Battlestar ended, he had a pilot, Virtuality, I think it was called. And it aired on Fox, and it was like a sort of 2-hour movie pilot thing. And did you see this, Dave?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it was amazing. It was like great. And I was like, God, I was so disappointed. It's like Fox totally killed it. It's like they didn't even give it the Firefly treatment. They just like, they killed it like when it was still in the cradle. I mean, it's like they aired the pilot. There was no promotion for it. Like I didn't know it was going to be on until like the day before, because like I saw somebody tweeting about it. And, you know, so they aired it one day with no promotion, like Friday night. And it was like in summer or something. It was like, so it wasn't like the time of year you would expect to see a new show launching. And so it's like, it basically had no shot. And, it was just really disappointing, because it was like, it really had a lot of promise. I thought it was really well written. Although I have to say, maybe it was just sparing me some, emotional turmoil down the road, preventing me from having to get invested in another show that, Ron Moore might ruin down the line. But, you know, I don't know. It was disappointing though. I mean, because like, you know, there isn't really any science fiction on the air right now that I'm interested in. Certainly nothing that takes place in space. Or if there is, maybe you guys should let us know. I don't know. I mean, I've sampled. I try to sample every new science fiction or fantasy show that comes on, and I mean, most of them I don't get past. I don't even finish watching the first episode, because, you know, I don't know. I think working in science fiction and fantasy, or just reading a lot of it and writing it in your case, you know, it's like when we spend so much time reading that stuff, we tend to get like sort of a higher standard, for our science fiction and fantasy. And it's like everything that you watch on, or almost everything you watch on film and television, it's like, it's just so many years and maybe decades behind the sophistication of the stuff that you find in prose. And so it just makes it a lot harder to, you know, sort of get into it when you have that sort of experience with science fiction.
I was going to say, you know, another advantage that, you know, books have over film and TV is that you don't have to deal with the characters giving off-screen interviews, you know, and it's really hard for me to enjoy a lot of these TV shows, because I can't help running across these interviews with the actors and just finding out what twits they are. And, you know, it makes it really hard to like continue to like their character. And I mean, the thing that you see all the time is they'll interview, it seems like every fantasy and science fiction TV show, they'll interview the actors, and a bunch of the actors will be like, well, this is a TV show that takes place in outer space 200 years in the future with robots, but it's not really science fiction.
Yeah.
Because it deals with serious themes.
Right.
And
Starbuck did that.
And it just makes you so angry at these morons that,
you know, I know what you mean. I mean, I used to write for Sci-Fi Wire, which is the website of the Sci-Fi Channel. Now it's called Blaster with no E. But you know, and I was doing all these interviews with authors, and so I was regularly checking the site, because I'd see when my interviews go up, and I mentioned that because that's the only reason I would look at the site, because every time that I went to look at the site as a fan to go see what news there was always some interview with some idiot like that saying that stupid stuff. But, you know, I don't know. I mean, I guess like I'm assuming Nathan Fillion doesn't feel that way. I don't know. He seems like he pretty well embraced geek culture, but the savvy actor will just run with that. You know, it's like, hey, the geek community loves Nathan Fillion, you know, and it's so, you know, which is Captain Mal from Firefly. You know, I'm kind of surprised that more people don't do that. And it's like they'll willfully just come out and alienate like a whole fan base, when it's like, you know, you realize like to promote your show, you're going to have to go to like Comic-Con and stuff. And like, you're going to be meeting these people in person. And it's like, you know, why would you want to purposely go out and alienate them? I mean, maybe it's just that they want mainstream acceptance so badly that they're willing to, you know, to cast off the fans that actually want to love them, in the effort to gain those people who probably never will.
Yeah. So if there are any actors listening to this, or aspiring actors, please never do this in an interview. Just please try to understand how stupid and intellectually dishonest and offensive it is, to when your show is sort of, there's this sort of long subculture of people who've worked really, really hard to develop these ideas, and then your show uses them and sort of, disses them at the same time, and sort of lies about where these ideas are coming from. It's really insulting.
There was actually one instance I remember that I didn't mind when the actress did it, because it was Hilary Swank saying about the core. Like, yeah, fine. If you want to say it's not science fiction, go ahead. Because, I mean, it's like, as we've mentioned on the show before, it's like one of the worst examples of science in a movie ever.
Yeah. Back in episode 10, we interviewed Tom Rogers, who wrote the book Insultingly Stupid Movie Physics, and he identified it as the worst science ever to appear in a movie.
Yeah. But yeah, but speaking of, actors talking about shows and whatever, like that's one of the things I always really appreciated, Star Trek: The Next Generation for, is that it seems like most of the cast, at least, never really did that. But like Patrick Stewart, I remember one time he did an interview and somebody was, asking him about Star Trek, and the interviewer said something really insulting about, Star Trek fans or whatever. And Patrick Stewart just called him out right in the interview. And he's like, "Oh, come on now, that's not, that's quite rude," or something like that, but it's just like, that is awesome. It's like, thank you, Patrick Stewart.
But I mean, it does seem like in Hollywood, it's hard to make a science fiction show and call it a science fiction show because of, I don't know, that Hollywood executives are all snorting so much coke. They haven't noticed that, out of the 25 highest grossing movies, like 22 of them are science fiction and fantasy movies or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I have heard people say that, like, they want to do science fiction shows and they have to, like, pretend it's something else.
Yeah.
Like, I think I've heard J.J. Abrams maybe say that about Alias, that he really wanted to do a science fiction show, but he had to, like, pitch it as, like, a spy thriller show. And then, once it's already in production, then you can sort of start introducing the science fiction stuff and gradually make it more and more of a science fiction show.
Actually, speaking of Alias, that's one of the reasons why I quit on Lost pretty early until you convinced me to keep watching it, because Alias started awesome. Like the 2-hour pilot of Alias is amazing. It's like amazing. I was so stunned by that. And then, but then like it goes downhill. Like, within the first season, I think I was already like, okay, I'm done. But it was really disappointing when that thing went down the tubes for me. But I mean, I know a lot of other people liked it, and it did last a while. But yeah, I'm a little dubious about him. That's one of the reasons why I haven't gotten into Fringe. It's just like, how many times am I going to let that guy burn me?
But it was kind of the same. It was kind of the same strategy they used for Lost. It starts out with very sort of understated science fiction elements, and then by season 4, they're like bouncing around in time and all this stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe they just really wanted to make the show they really wanted to make was Touched by an Angel, and they couldn't do it, so they had to like fool us into thinking it was a science fiction show for like 5 years, and then in the last episode they could make the show they always really wanted to make. And another problem I often have with sort of fantasy and science fiction TV and movies is that the people making them seem not to have read any of the fiction, any of the books and stories. It seems like they've only seen other TV and movies, and so they have this very shallow grasp of what the genre is capable of. And nothing sort of drove this home to me more. I was watching the special features for Farscape, and this guy comes on and he says, this show, we're hoping to have like all the best stuff from science fiction all in one show, everything from Star Wars to Star Trek and everything in between, and it's like, it's like saying, we hope to have every color from gray to dark gray. It's like they just have no conception of what's out there. And it's really a shame because, when they get, novelists and short story writers involved with TV and film, I mean, some of the results have been really, really amazing. When I was a kid, like you mentioned, George R. R. Martin. George R. R. Martin was involved with this Twilight Zone revival in the 80s that I used to watch as a kid. And man, I just loved that show so much. There were so many crazy ideas. And I was saying sort of about how TV doesn't lend itself well to science fiction often because of the budget and stuff. And I think another reason is because, science fiction and fantasy sort of thrives on newness and novelty. In a series, you have the same characters episode after episode after episode, and there's only so much that they can change. And whereas an anthology show like Twilight Zone or Outer Limits or Tales from the Crypt, I really love those shows because, man, anything can happen in those shows. The characters can turn out to be someone completely unexpected, and characters can all die. Who even knows? And so like a couple of did you ever watch this Twilight Zone?
I don't know if I saw that era. I've certainly seen the original Rod Serling Twilight Zones, and I've seen and I saw the more recent reinvention of it in the early aughts there with Forrest Whitaker as the host. And I remember thinking like, okay, well, I'll give this a shot. I'm excited that they're bringing it back. And then like it was like one of the earliest episodes, like the first or second episode, it was like a go back in time and kill Hitler when he's a baby plot. And I'm like, what again? Come on. It's like you pick one of the horriest cliches and put it in one of your earliest episodes. But no, I haven't. I don't know if I've seen any of those, but I may have.
I think none of the revivals since that have been any good that I've seen. But the one in the 80s, man, some of them were really good, and they've really stuck with me. Like there was this one where there's this kid and his parents are always bickering, and he asks them to take him to this theme park. And so they go to this theme park, and you sort of go through the gates, and you kind of get separated. They take the kid off one way and the parents off another way. And he kind of gets led down this hallway, and all the parents whose kids have taken them to this theme park are all kind of like in cells, with glass, and they're all sort of imprisoned in this theme park. And how it works is you take your bad parents, and you get to pick new parents, and the parents kind of they learn their lesson by being imprisoned in this theme park, and only when they have learned to get along with each other and be nicer do they have a chance of having another kid come along and pick them to be your new parents. And that was really creepy, and I've always really remembered that one. There's this one too. This woman discovers a necklace in her backyard while she's gardening, and she discovers that it has the ability to freeze time. And then at the end of the episode, there's like a nuclear war breaks out, and she freezes time, and she goes outside, and there's just like this missile hanging in the air above her house. And so if she unfreezes time ever again, that's the end. And so it's just such a creepy open-ended ending where you just sort of, I spent so much time thinking about what would you do in that situation? Could you keep time frozen for decades and evacuate the cities? Do somehow disarm the missiles? Who knows? That's the kind of thing you can have in an anthology show like that.
Yeah, I don't really foresee too many more of them being attempted, just because, none of the recent ones have made much of a go of it. I mean, there was the Twilight Zone, with Forrest Whitaker there that, didn't last very long. And, more recently, Showtime and ABC, one did Masters of Horror and one did Masters of Science Fiction, and, both by the same sort of producers. And, but they had like a Master of Horror director. So they had John Carpenter and they had John Carpenter and Stuart Gordon, who had directed a bunch of H.P. Lovecraft films and people like that. So they were the master, but then they also adapted a lot of short stories from masters of there, and they did the same thing with the science fiction one. So it had promise, because it had that sort of built-in idea of potential star power associated with the episodes. But, even then it didn't last long. Although, I mean, I can't really say that I was terribly surprised. I mean, it wasn't all that great. And I mean, it was that was a show I really wanted to succeed. I really wanted to like, because I mean, like you, I really like the idea of an anthology show. But, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to trying something like that. I mean, to me, the closest that we've seen to what seems like a really feasible anthology show was that show Sliders. Did you ever see that?
Maybe once or twice.
Yeah. So, I mean, if for those who aren't familiar with it, it was it's a parallel world show. So there's this group of people, somebody invents this technology that allows you to travel from our world to other alternate Earths. And so they can't really control the device, it's a sort of a random group of people that get stuck through this thing, and so they're trapped. So it's sort of like Quantum Leap, where they're going from scenario to scenario. But the thing about it is, while that's not an anthology show, obviously, it does allow you to do almost anything from week to week. But then you have the same characters in the show, so it's you have the advantage of a regular show where you have the same characters that people can get invested in, and the characters can grow and develop. But then you also have the advantage of sort of an anthology show a bit, because at the end of each episode, they jump out of the world that they were in and they end up in a new one. There's one I remember quite vividly. They end up in this world where they ended up in this one world, and they don't have any money or anything, and they can't buy anything. But then they find out that there's these ATMs that they can go to, and they can just ask for as much money as they want, and it'll just give them however much money they want. And so, like, everybody thinks they're crazy when they're doing that, but it turns out it's like what they didn't understand is that for every amount of money they get, they're being entered into this lottery, and the lottery is being used to, control the population. So, if you enter, if you take out money, then you get more chances entering into the lottery. And then if your name is chosen, then you're one of the people who gets put to death in order to, keep the population under control. And so, I mean, obviously that's an idea that's been used before. I mean, it's obviously riffing off Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. But I thought it was pretty well done. I mean, admittedly, I haven't seen it since I was like 15 or something. So maybe it's not as good as I remember, but I remember really liking it for a while. But then I know it did go off the rails at some point where they started having sort of, kind of much dumber plots happening from week to week.
Well, I mean, and speaking of George R.R. Martin again, I mean, he had been developing a series called Doorways, which was the same exact premise. And then Sliders came out, and so people have asked him, what was Doorways? What was it going to be? And he's like, well, it was going to be Sliders, except good. But I think
it's too bad. That's too bad. I would have much rather seen George Martin's take on it.
But I think it was one of these like sort of suspicious things where, something is, is in development, and then something, really suspiciously similar to it comes out, like the same thing happened with Babylon 5 and Deep Space, Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Yeah.
Like the other like anthology episode I really want to draw people's attention to was like the best Outer Limits. There was also, a sort of a relaunch of the Outer Limits in the 90s. And the best episode of that I saw was this one called Quality of Mercy. But it's, there's this sort of star pilot from Earth, and Earth is at war with sort of creepy looking aliens, and he's been captured, and they're holding him kind of in this slimy cell and taking him out periodically to be interrogated, and but they can't get the information they want out of him because he's sort of been conditioned to be immune to torture. Then they throw another prisoner in with him who's this female cadet, and then the aliens start taking her away, and each time they bring her back, they've taken off a piece of her body and replaced it with an alien part. And so she comes back and she has like this sort of creepy, scaly alien hands and like a creepy, scaly alien eye and stuff. And piece by piece, she's being turned into one of the aliens.
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of those Outer Limits. That I think that era that you're talking about, the Sci-Fi Channel was airing a bunch of them at some point, and I caught several of them. They adapted James Patrick Kelly's story, Think Like a Dinosaur. Did you ever see that one?
No, I've read the story. I never saw that though.
Yeah, no, if I recall correctly, the adaptation was actually pretty good. I mean, I'd love to see, more things, more of these anthology shows, and more of them, specifically adapting short stories. Because I mean, I think if you're going to start with something that's already proven to be good, like maybe pick award-winning things. It's like, so there's some consensus there that a lot of people who know science fiction think that these things are good. You start from that standpoint, and then you sort of adapt it. Then I mean, you're more likely to come up with something that's actually going to be good. Or better yet, just hire some science fiction and fantasy writers to write your shows. I mean, they could write original stuff for a TV show.
Yeah, for Outer Limits, they also adapted George R. Martin's Sand Kings, which is one of my favorite short stories. The adaptation, it's okay.
Yeah, I didn't see that one.
But definitely read the story though. The story is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, the story is amazing.
I mean, one thing I saw this post recently I thought was really interesting, but this guy was, I don't know, he works in Hollywood, I think, but he was sort of saying, and this had never really occurred to me before, but essentially every time there's a science fiction show, it gets canceled usually right away, and then there's a big letter writing campaign, of the fans trying to save it. I mean, this happened with Farscape, it happened with Firefly, but this guy was saying that by the time a show gets canceled, it's really too late for a letter writing campaign, that by that point the studio couldn't change their minds even if they wanted to, because the actors have all been hired for other shows and the sets have all been broken down and dumped in dumpsters and stuff. And so really the time to start a letter writing campaign is the instant you discover a new show that you like. Start your letter writing campaign then, and try to show the studio how popular it is. So yeah, I would encourage people, if you find a new, particularly science fiction show that's good, start promoting it as much as you can right away. Don't wait until you hear it's been canceled.
All right, so well, that's basically our show. We have a couple of little announcements that friends of ours have asked us to make. So my friend Emily asked me to mention the North American Discworld Convention 2011. It's a fan-run convention held to celebrate the works of Sir Terry Pratchett, who is awesome. And it's happening in Madison, Wisconsin, July 8th through 11th. Guest of honor is Mr. Terry Pratchett himself. More information is at the website. It's nadwcon.org. And other guests include Stephen Baxter, Esther Friesner, Jennifer Brell, who's Terry Pratchett's editor, and several other people, and who are all wonderful, I'm sure. Oh, and so the other announcement is the fabulous Starship Sofa, the Hugo Award-winning Starship Sofa podcast, is having a writer's workshop. If you want to learn more, go to starshipsofa.com/shop/workshops/writers. And on the website there, it's actually called the Holodeck Writers Workshop. I wonder if Star Trek knows about that. But let's see, the guests they have featured here are Gregory Frost, James Patrick Kelly, who we mentioned earlier, Michael Swanwick, Mercurio D. Rivera, and Sheila Williams, who's the editor of Asimov Science Fiction.
Yeah, and that's our show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is up to 27 ratings at iTunes, so thanks to everyone who's rated it so far. Can we make it up to 28? Maybe we'll find out. We would really appreciate it if people would do that. And of course, we're accepting donations as always. You can do that by going into our website at geeksguideshow.com and clicking on the donation button. And thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of IO9. For this episode's show notes, to subscribe to this podcast, or for more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephatadams.com or davidbarkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.